Welcome, everyone. Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is the Thursday, January 7, 2021 meeting of the Common Council's Planning, Economic Development, and Land Use Committee. Committee members present, Tom Hoey, Judy Doche, Joyce Love, Alfredo Ballerin, and myself, Kathy Fahey. Other council members, Richard Conti, Owusu Anani, and I see Corey. Is that Corey Ellis?
Yes, it is, Kathy.
Hi, Corey, and Council President Corey Ellis. Staff, Michelle Andre, John Rafael Pichardo, and we also have from the administration, we have Rick, thanks for joining us from Buildings and Codes, and we have Brad Glass from the Planning Department. And then we have Aaron Glennon from the Planning and Department. John Myers from Historic Resource Commission. Thank you, John, for coming. Danielle, I see I missed you. Our City Clerk, Danielle Gillespie. And we also have Cara Macri from the Historic Albany Foundation and Bill Brandow. Bill, I think you're just a concerned citizen at this point, right? Okay. And there's somebody who's trying to connect over here. I can't see who that is. All right, we're here tonight to discuss Local M of 2020. That's a local law amending Part 4 of the Historic Resources Commission of Article 12 of Chapter 42 of the Code of the City of Albany in relation to appointments to the Historic Resources Commission and the jurisdiction of such body to review emergency actions within historic resources overlay districts, and further providing for a report on emergency demolition and stabilization procedures. We'll also be discussing Ordinance 219220, an ordinance amending Article 9, that's the building construction regulation part, and Article 11A, the vacant building registry of Part 2 of Chapter 133 of the Code of City of Albany in relation to emergency building actions in historic districts. So I thought it would make sense if we would talk about the ordinance first, but I'm going to turn to Rich Conti, since Rich is the main sponsor of this legislation. And Rich, if you can fill us in as to why you were bringing this legislation forward. Of course, I can't see Richard now. Oh, there he is. Richard, unmute. You got to unmute.
Okay, there I am. The two, I mean, the ordinance and the local law do mesh together. And it's just because the way the code is constructed, one has to be done by local law and part is done by ordinance, but they meant to mesh together. So, and the overriding intent of the proposal is really to establish the role and authority of the Historic Resources Commission with regard to emergency actions. Emergency actions can either be a demolition or a stabilization under the building code. But with regard to emergency actions in historic districts, as far as oversight, review, and ability to have input or on policy or make recommendations. So that's the overarching goal of the proposals. So quickly, let me just hit on the local law first. The local law, it does make some provisions regarding the filling of appointments to the HRC. This is an issue that we've discussed in the past about members of various boards serving long past their expiration of their terms. And I think that all of the members of the HRC right now are actually, except for maybe one, are serving beyond their terms of appointment. So this is just to try to get to that issue we've talked about, not just on HRC, but other boards, about timely appointments or reappointments from the executive that are subject to confirmation by the council. Section 2 of the local law amends the section that really deals with the powers and role of the HRC to insert in there review of emergency actions within historic districts, and also their right to periodically, be able to make recommendations with regard to policy and procedure to the mayor and the council, and also provides that it be a standing agenda item at HRC meetings. So that kind of establishes the role, part of the role and the authority of the HRC with regard to emergency demolitions. Section 3 of the local law unconsolidated basically provides for a one-time report from the HRC to review and assess policies and procedures related to emergency actions under the building code, and then to report back to the council and the mayor with their findings and any recommendations. So that's just a one-time report from the HRC. So the local law, as I say, then meshes in with provisions in the ordinance that relate to the building code. Some of this just relates to kind of clarifying or refining some of the standards for emergency action. I don't necessarily think they're inconsistent with current policy. And I did, forward previously some comments that I gotten from Rick earlier on the draft. The first one, and some people might remember these because they actually are some proposals that had been made by our former colleague, council member Casolaro, in the past. The first one amendment just seeks to define a direct hazard that might necessitate immediate action. The other amendment relates to a demolition being really a last resort. The other one provides that when there's a this is really the crux, when there is an emergency action within an historic district, this is the new subsection E that's on in section 1 of the ordinance, that when there's an emergency action in an historic district, that the HRC should be notified of that action prior to the action. Basically, it's a notification provision so that members are aware of an action being taken place. And that this provides that a transmittal of any structural or engineering reports and any findings and considerations that are the basis of the action also be transmitted to the HRC at the same time. The section 2 of the ordinance relates to quarterly reports on the vacant building registry, and just adds some additional provisions. First of all, that the members of the HRC receive the quarterly reports, and also adds some additional provisions that the report include by district, and there are a number of different historic districts, the number of buildings on the vacant building registry, and the categories that they fit into with regard to what's already established under the requirements for the reporting under the vacant building registry. That's the crux of what the two proposals do, basically establishing HRC authority and then also providing the HRC some information related to emergency actions, and then also providing for that one-time report to the council and the mayor, which is the review of policy and procedure and recommendations that they might have. And that's the proposal. And there is, I know that planning department recently completed I'm bragging my historic district policy.
Historic preservation plan?
Yes, historic preservation plan.
Easier than you thought.
Yes, which is very lengthy and detailed. A number of, I don't know, it's about 164 pages or something like that. But I think that elements of what is proposed here are consistent with some of the provisions within that report, and kind of provides the ability actually to build on what was in that report. Maybe, at some point later, Brad or Aaron can, quickly touch on some of those issues. So, and that's it.
Okay, so we've received letters from, in addition to Rick's commentary, we received letters from the Historic Albany Foundation, and then John Myers from the Historic Resource Commission members wrote about, commented on the legislation. So why don't we turn to them just to get their input about the legislation? John, can you talk a little bit about Historic Resources Commission and their opinions about this legislation? Thoughts?
Well, thank you. Yeah, my name's John Myers. I currently serve as the chair of the Historic Resources Commission. And we're delighted with the action that has been proposed here and the modification to the ordinance or the city code. I think it does dovetail with many of the recommendations that were enshrined in the recently completed preservation plan. So, guarding our historic inventory and keeping an eye on what's happening in a very close manner is critical to what we really see as our mission to continue the nurturing and the fostering of appropriate development in the historic districts. I'll just take a moment and read the document that we submitted, just so everyone hears it. But we met last evening. We had an HRC planning our review session. And essentially, we said the Historic Resources Commission has begun its review of the proposed local law M of 2020, amending part 4 of chapter 42 of the code of the city of Albany, in particular part 13 associated with emergency actions. We applaud the efforts to engage in better protection of Albany's historic buildings through this proposed legislation. Every historic structure contributes to the city's history and provides unequaled potential to provide housing and opportunity for our citizens. The commission will undertake further review and discussion to ensure the objective of this proposed legislation can be met through the alignment of responsibilities and actions of the commission and the Department of Buildings and Regulatory Compliance. Specifically, we will further assess the term emergency action and work to understand the existing city policy and procedures and consider what reporting on demolition and stabilization procedures will be most productive. We also seek clarity on the bill sponsor's intentions with the term review, when that review would occur, and the sponsor's intention for that review. I think in Rich's opening comments, he's clarified where he was intending to go with this proposed legislation. And in closing, thank you for your consideration of this important initiative. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss the proposal with its sponsors to deepen our understanding of intent. We look forward to providing the commission's comments and recommendations. So that's the substance of what we drafted to be presented here. But following up, I think that, again, in concert with the preservation plan, this aligns precisely with many of the concerns that we have expressed about emergencies and the nature of them. We certainly stand ready to work very closely with the building department and would offer our expertise as it relates to buildings, and hopefully in this review environment would be engaged before a building became an emergency. We understand the nature of emergencies and have no intention of obstructing public safety and the timely removal of an imminent hazard. But our goal is to really be engaged before it becomes an imminent hazard, so that we can all evaluate the options open to us for stabilization and reuse, and where those opportunities exist, certainly again lend our support and expertise in pursuing that goal.
Thank you, John. So when I was reading through Rick LaJoy's comments and then reading, the text of the legislation, there were, you want to have that engineering report, you want to have the notification to the HRC in the legislation, but there are some obstacles to doing that. And I guess maybe we can begin to talk about some of those. It would be helpful to get the planning department's input on some of the legislation, some parts of it. And Brad, do you want to, or someone else, talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, really, John covered a lot of what I would have said. I think that, I was at the meeting, the HRC meeting last night, and, they really want to take a cooperative approach to solving, what's a problem. It doesn't have an easy answer, which is, something that we struggle with. And I'm sure you'll hear from Rick a little bit about some of the challenges that he faces. But, I think all working together, more people at the table, we can, we can think of some new ideas potentially, and, assist where necessary and get out ahead of these. Because I think, unfortunately, a lot of the, emotion resides in that initial day before the emergency or at the emergency. And at that point, it's too late. So, I think the key is really getting out ahead of the problem. And I've seen some strides so far from the city in doing that. It's not something our department worked directly on. I know Sam Wells and obviously Rick are very engaged with that. And, I think what the preservation plan spoke to really was the notification of, the HRC sometimes learns about these things secondhand, and they are some of the, professionals. They are all very qualified and have backgrounds that are very interested in the subject, and they don't, sometimes hearing it secondhand can be frustrating for them. I know the building department has already made some attempts at providing those reports to us. So, hopefully this, legislation underscores that need. And again, I think there's a lot of good potential here.
So Rick, is Rick involved in these, will Rick be involved then with these conversations with the HRC?
Yeah, the HRC specifically noted wanting to engage with Rick on the issue and the legislation for putting in their final thoughts.
Okay. See, others who want to give some input in this, questions by committee members? Amy Levine, the attorney for the planning department.
Hi, thank you. I spoke with Marisa earlier, and we have some concerns about the appointment provision. I think, there's some question, I think, whether or not it intrudes upon the mayor's power under the charter and would need to be a referendum under the home rule law. I also, I'm curious to know, I mean, so the provision in here is that you say that the mayor needs to appoint a new member within 30 days. I think for one thing, that's pretty difficult with HRC in particular, because they need board members with such special knowledge in historic matters. But also, what happens if the mayor doesn't appoint a new member in 30 days?
Probably nothing. I think I was trying to make a point here about some of our frustration in terms of boards, not just HRC, but others, with members serving way beyond their expired terms or vacancies, which basically undercuts the council's advise and consent authority under the charter and under other provisions of local law. So that was, I guess I was trying to make a point, maybe more than anything else, but it's an ongoing concern that we have. So that provision doesn't directly relate to the emergency action issue that we're trying to get at, but kind of just sort of like as I was in that section, maybe throw it in. And I know also that there's been some discussion, I believe the HRC is right now 9 members. There's been some discussion as to whether or not the number of members on the HRC should be reduced. It was expanded a few years ago when we were dealing with archaeological issues. And I think that's when we added the provision that there be, I think 2 members that had to have an archaeological background. So that was the last time. I think otherwise it had been 7 members, but I don't know if that's an issue that should be discussed while we're in that section of the code or not. But let's say the major thrust is the emergency action issue, and the appointment part was just as I was in that area, I kind of trying to make that point there.
I do understand that this is not, the major
Right.
portion of the legislation, and I'm sorry to, take this little tangent here, but in particular with HRC though, and I know that Aaron can speak more to this, but it can be very difficult to find people who have the appropriate, background to serve on HRC, and 30 days seems like a fairly short time period for that. And I think HRC is really, it's very different from BZA and planning board in that sense, because, the ordinance also, it specifically requires that board members have this kind of expertise.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. So we can think more about that, I guess. Other comments or questions? Judy?
Well, just on that point, it seems to me as though if you are reappointing, if the mayor is continuing somebody on the board and it is a reappointment, that there should be no difficulty in meeting a 30-day requirement. And I think that we should keep that provision in there. And I think, for others to say essentially within, still have some sort of time frame, like maybe 90 days, for the appointment of when somebody has left the board. So I share Richard's frustration that sometimes people are continued in perpetuity without the administration taking the action to submit the reappointment. And there's been improvements, certainly this year. I think I've seen a lot of improvements with us seeing more of these appointments or reappointments on a timely manner. But so I just want to comment on that, and I agree that it's a less important provision, but I just didn't want to kind of let that go. With regard to Rick LaJoy's comments, he says that we are mandated by the state to commence the action within 24 hours of the determination. So although notifying the HRC when we email out the notification to all the other necessary parties, there's no real time allowed for review. I'm wondering where we can find that requirement that requires action be taken within 24 hours. Frankly, I looked at the general city law, section 20, subdivision 35, and it doesn't look to me, so I wasn't seeing such a hard and fast mandate for, quick turnaround for these things. And I think that from my conversations with Kim Alvarez, part of the frustration is who is retained as the engineer. There may be a predisposition to demolition. And I'm hoping that the HRC can look at that issue with the administration. And, I know that there's probably bidding requirements and that kind of thing, but often municipalities can have more than one
We do.
consultant on retainer. You do?
Yes, we do. And when we've used the others, it's never changed the outcome, just for the record. And all these engineers, they make more money on stabilizations than they would ever make on declaring something a demolition. There's nothing is gained by that. Those are just statements that are made without any basis. It's just a personality issue, in my opinion.
So I think that something the HRC could look at is when you say it makes no difference, for there actually to be a retrospective review of the reports for maybe over the last 3 years, and who has been retained and how much, et cetera. So I think that would be, with regard to this report that is due in 180 days, I think that would be something that could be just one data point that you're looking at. And like many things, it can illuminate the discussion just by having the facts, I think. Not that I presuppose the facts one way or another, but since the issue's been raised, that's a great thing then for people to figure out whether there's whether it's something more than a personality issue or not, kind of thing. But I am interested in this 24-hour requirement by the state.
Yeah, and they'll tell you that if it is not started within 24 hours, was it imminent? Is there, that's their, because the waiver the variance has to be signed off on, et cetera. So, and that's, long prior to me, that's just the standard.
So that's not a law.
No, well, I think
That's
it's in the building.
guidance?
Correct. I'm sorry.
That's guidance from the state?
Yeah, no, there was something in writing. I can
Trying
get
to
it.
find it.
I think it was 1203, the building code, but yeah.
So, Rick, I'm getting the impression that what you're saying is they say, if you don't commence it within 24 hours, then it wasn't imminent. So therefore you have to follow the lengthier notice and review process. Is that what you're saying?
Just that, well, it's been stated from the Department of Labor that if it isn't down, or if it hasn't begun within 24 hours, the waiver isn't any good because it's not considered an emergency. So there's a special waiver that has to be given in order to do the asbestos in place, et cetera, because they're too unsafe. You can't go in there and do the abatement because they're collapsing. So that's just part of their language.
Okay.
And so we'll find out if that's where that is in the law. Maybe that would be helpful.
Sure.
Any other comments from committee members? Tom, and then Alfredo.
Yeah, hi. I had a question for John Myers. John, thank you for serving on the HRC. What's your opinion on getting people to serve on the board when we do have vacancies? I belong to volunteer groups, and one of the things I remember being told, find your replacement when you start. That should be the first thing you can do. Is there a way we could build up like a bench? So if somebody drops out, we could bring somebody in with the qualifications that are needed. I was just wondering what your opinion on that is.
Well, I'm sure we could. I mean, there are a lot of professionals in the community that, may be prime candidates for the service on the board. So, having a list to choose from, may be a way of, implementing that and short-circuiting a lengthy search process. We also want to balance the board and have a fairly wide perspective of representatives of the population that possess the various skills, a broader range of skills. We're not all architects. We're not all structural engineers. So there needs to be some balance, and maybe we need to look at our own composition to see if there is kind of an ideal composition for the board, so that there is multiple viewpoints are represented and when we deliberate on various actions.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
But I think the idea, if it's a reappointment, 30 days is probably very reasonable. And if it's selecting and finding and convincing someone to serve, 90 days may be more appropriate in terms of 60 or 90 days, just giving a little more time for that to be handled, in a thoughtful manner.
Thank you.
Alfredo?
Thank you. I'd like to hear a little more from Rick, to be honest. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Rick, but I really want to make sure that what we're doing here is something that's going to benefit our city. I unfortunately have had the experience of several fires in my ward over the last few years, and I've seen the pain residents go through when they lose everything and they lose their home. But I've also seen the pain of what residents have to deal with when we have an abandoned building that's been at flames that, is a constant scar. And I think of 20 Benson Street, and you can Google it if you want, and you can see what I'm talking about as a constant scar in our neighborhood. So I want to make sure that whatever we're doing is something that's going to benefit our neighborhoods and not allow the healing process to begin. So I'd like to hear a little more from Rick, if you don't mind.
Okay. Rick, do you want to make some comments? I know you're going to be working with the HRC, but if you could comment on some of the concerns you have about the legislation and what Alfredo is saying.
As far as the legislation goes, I'm a proponent. I think it's good. I embrace working, together. I just think we got to work out I think there's some of the changes I would think would have to happen is the timing of it. For instance, when I'm standing at the building at 3 a.m. because the wall blew out, or just 2 nights ago it happened, that's not the time to bring in someone to let's see what we can talk about and see what we can do. It has to happen long before. These buildings are not secrets. They're not, all of a sudden we realize there's one that's coming down. They're, been cited forever. The neighbors know about it. You all know about it. We all know about it. So that's the reality of it. I really think this would be even more beneficial. And I'll just play out a scenario. If we cite a building, for the vacant building, and, during our inspection, we have real concern, and this happens often. We'll cite the owner and tell them, we need an engineer's report. We need somebody to assess this building within 7 to 14 days, because we believe it's heading in the wrong direction and it could become a public hazard. When there's no compliance, I think that's when it would be most beneficial to then reach out to everybody and say, here's a building. It's on its way. We know it's coming. We need to act on it. This is the time to act on it. So this is where we've, it's not an emergency. It hasn't been deemed, to me, once it's been deemed an imminent threat, we can't take the foot off the gas because one of us might think, well, it's been that way for a year. What's another 6 hours? Because then I'm on the hook. So if it's called, we got to move. But if I know it's coming in that direction and, I can give you the list, we got plenty of them. That's when I say, hey, here's a building. What can we do? Not as I'm standing there with the contractors, this is when we need to get in there. This is where we have enough worry about the building that I have the legal standing to gain access if need be, if we see something beginning to give or give way. That's the time. And I'll give you an example if I can. 167 3rd Avenue. We cited it in October. My inspector was there, said we need to have, we need an engineer's report, please, within 14 days. Now we're into January. We never got a response. We never got the report. Our pictures show a corner on the foundation beginning to erode and some missing brick. Fast forward to 3 nights ago, we get a call at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, water's coming out of the 2nd floor. Upon arrival, the entire side of the foundation, and it's above ground brick about 6 feet, has collapsed. The entire back wall has disengaged and is, floating essentially. The sills go, everything's gone. There's nothing there. And we can't now, we don't have the ability to say, well, if we get in there and stabilize it and fix it up, someone could make something out of it. If, as a city, if I put somebody in there and God forbid that thing lets go, we're on the hook. So the imminent threat is there. We had to take it down. October, when we had that notice and we saw the beginnings of it, and that's just how fast and how rapid this can happen. That's when we should have come in there and, brought, whoever that might be, whoever you all want to be part of that conversation. Those are the things that we, that's when we should be doing it. So that's, quite honestly, that's the only issue I have in the entire thing, is the timing of when we think we want to have these conversations and reviews. I think they have to start prior to being called there as an emergency, before it's ever deemed an emergency, because we have the access, we know it's there, we know it's coming. I just think it's a lot better plan to go, to do it earlier than later.
And Rick, can you fill people in? I mean, when there's no compliance,
Yes, ma'am.
doesn't it end up going to the courts? And then it gets held up there, and then aren't you looking at some possible ways to, I don't know, get around that?
Yeah, I mean, we are, sorry, I see Amy has her hand up.
You have to
You're on mute.
unmute.
I just wanted to mention, from the law department standpoint, it's a liability issue. And, it's very important that the director of buildings has the authority to deal with property that's in imminent danger.
Just to clarify.
Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, and again, it's not the intent of anything I'm proposing to impede the ability of the building department to act in an emergency situation. And, in a lot of respect, information provided to the HRC, it'll be, it's going to be a retroactive review as opposed to, being on site and giving approval. It's not the intent to give HRC prior approval of emergency actions, but to establish their role and authority in that area, so that maybe we develop policy to prevent or minimize those actions. And I'll note, I think also another provision that in a way relates to what Rick had talked about in the preservation plan, and Brad or Aaron can correct me, but I think there was some discussion or reference to also doing something like an early warning system that would help in advance to identify those potential problem buildings that maybe get some potential attention, ahead of time attention or something, or lining up potential, making it aware so people who are potentially interested in development or rehab or saving a building can be out there. I had a building, I had my earlier the background 141 Dove Street, which Rick is familiar with, a building in my ward, which was demoed last year. And it was a shame to see it go down because it was right in a streetscape of row houses where you then have this one building coming down right in the middle of two occupied buildings on each side, one of which I think there was kind of adjoining in a way, and you had to take special care to bring it down. But it was kind of sort of like after the fact, I was approached by someone who has a reputation of doing a lot of rehabs in the neighborhood, who was interested in trying to go in there. The time he contacted me and everything else, it was too late. But potentially, if we had that kind of early warning system up earlier, there potentially could have been an opportunity to line that person up with the owner or whatever,
Yeah.
but to do something.
Mhm.
And that's what we really need to focus on, as well as the retroactive review and just making sure HRC has information so that they can be a part of this whole process.
And I'm a huge proponent of that, Richard. I think even, like I said, implementing from the time, we cite and there's no compliance at the same time that we're then moving it into prosecution, that would be the opportune time for, those of us to get in there and have these conversations and look, particularly when we know it's a building that no one's answering because nobody's taking ownership, et cetera. I think that would be hugely beneficial to the city. Nobody wants them to come down. And clearly it's wasted money. I mean, it's money that you're never getting back, structure you're never getting back. I think that would be a great system for us to put in internally, where we're notifying the HRC at that point of the non-compliance.
No, and we certainly would welcome that whole engagement, throughout this process, because buildings don't just suddenly become a problem.
You're right.
It's an ongoing thing, and the building department and you, Rick, are in these buildings far earlier and often, and recognize that there are imminent issues or issues that are pending that might not take a great deal of effort to rectify, but it becomes an ownership thing and entering a property, and how does one go about doing it? And sometimes and you've identified this, that the legal pitfalls that you face with building ownership and trying to get something done, can be very protracted through the court system. In the meantime, it's demolition by default or by neglect that we're seeing. So I think with the vacant building ordinance and the work that Sam Wells is doing and the work that you're doing, I think it's time for all of us to kind of link arms and see how we can solve this problem and save as much of the built environment as we can.
Amen.
Because it clearly it's a lost resource. We're seeing chunks of neighborhoods disappear, and and missing teeth in continuous rows, and that's part of the character of the city that we all want to see preserved.
Okay, thank you, John. And I see Owusu, I apologize. I see your hand up, and Judy, you wanted to speak too. So Owusu, go ahead.
Thank you, Kathy. First, I just want to commend the work that Building and Codes and the Planning Department has been doing over the past years. I want to thank Rick LaJoy, as we have had several instances of emergency demolitions. And I just want to thank your staff and all the people that you have worked with, making sure that the neighbors have some comfort, because those times when a property is being demolished, whether it's due to a fire or due to neglect, those are the times where elected officials and also city officials have to show some compassion, right? And I just want to thank you so much for everything that you do for the city on that front. I have several questions, but one was already answered as relates to the mandate. But the first one is, if there is a building that the city that we know is a historic, but receiving violations, do you have a system in place of notifying the historic HRC?
We do not currently, it hadn't been asked of us prior to, this coming out. And believe me, we're more than happy to notify as many people as possible.
Okay. And also too, this is a question for HRC. Once you're notified that a property has had several violations and is slated for demolition, what are some of the steps that you would take?
Well, if it's not declared an emergency or an imminent threat, then, there certainly have been opportunities that go way back where we've gone in and taken a look at it. We've done a tour through the building and, can certainly offer guidance as to what appropriate actions could be to stabilize it. I think the issue becomes the ownership of the building and how it all gets paid for. And that is a complicating factor. But no, if we would stand ready at any time to go look at buildings and see what can be done. But I think, in Rick's defense, once it becomes a declared an emergency, I mean, we all have to step back and say, well, it's unfortunate, but that is something to protect the public welfare and to protect the city from potential liability. There aren't many options at that point.
Aaron,
Yeah,
did
thank
you,
you.
Aaron,
sorry.
did you want to comment on that question? Alyssa's
Yeah.
question?
Thank you, Kathy. Well, I'll say one of the things that Richard had brought up was the early warning system within the preservation plan. And part of the goal of that is also that we can identify potential properties that may be headed towards vacancy. And if we can work with the preservation community or organizations like Historic Albany and identify potential contractors or parties that would be interested in taking on those properties for stabilization and rehab. That is part of what we're hoping to do with the early warning system. But again, we do sometimes run into issues with property owners that we can't get a hold of or may not have interest in transferring those properties to interested parties.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then so my concern is more so when I first read the legislation that was put forward, it seemed like when the emergency demolition had been declared that the plan department or building and codes have to notify HRC first before the demolition takes place. Am I reading that wrong, or is there any?
No,
For example, if there's an emergency demolition right now, can Rick LaJoy, if this legislation passed, take action on it, or does he have to notify HRC first before taking action?
the intention, well, it's notification. So the intention was, and I understand there's some issues that Rick had raised about when engineering reports, et cetera, are available. But the intention was that when there's an emergency demolition decision to do an emergency action, that the members of the HRC be notified. And the intent was that they received the engineering report and findings at that point. And I understand Rick said those are not necessarily available at the same time. I just note that members of the council, when there's an emergency demolition in my area, I get an email from Val with the emergency demo order. And I assume that is sent out as soon as the order is issued as notification. But the intent here was to, if it's an emergency action, it's not intended to impede the ability of the building department to act in an emergency situation, but to provide that notification to the relevant parties so that they have that information. And then, in some cases, it's going to be a retroactive review of why did this happen, what happened, et cetera.
Thank you, Richard. And again, just want to close out and say that building, urban blight in the city of Albany is a disease that all of us are passionate about and want to get rid of. And I know that Richard said this earlier, the notification as relates to common council members or HRC. I remember there was a scenario where in the 10th ward, where a mother passed away and the property was owned by two sisters. One wanted to keep it, one wanted to sell it. As a common council member, when I first got into office, I was able to reach out to Rick LaJoy's office, able to get some contacts, reach out to the two sisters. After months and months of going back and forth, we were able to finally reach out and connect them to someone who was interested in purchasing that property. And I believe that was a success story. And I think about this legislation, all of us working together, notify HRC, notify common council members in existence, because as common council members, we're the eyes and ears on the ground. And if there's a property that could be rehabbed, we would take the appropriate actions and response. But I also want to be clear that this is not putting a handicap on building on codes as relates to taking a demolition in place, because there is some neighbors who want, it's a scar, like Alfredo Ballerin said, and very too often it's an eyesore to the neighborhood. And there are some properties that need emergency demolition immediately. So I just want to thank everyone and all of us for working together to address this issue. Urban blight is not a disease here in the city of Albany. It's all across all urban cities. And I'm glad to have Rick LaJoy, Sam Wells leading this charge. So I just want to thank everyone.
Okay, thank you, Owusu. Judy, do you still have comments or questions?
Yeah, I think following up a little bit on what Owusu just said, it's always, I think government in decision-making, it's always a balance of, figuring out when something's, an emergency and you need to take it down, how to best deal with the potential, impacts on a particular neighborhood, on a community. And so I think, finding that right balance when we're dealing with legislation is important. I do want to note, and Amy, I'm probably going to be following up with you with regard to some liability issues that I am concerned about that relate to city-owned property. Again, it's a matter of talking about balance. And I appreciate liability issues. And sometimes there's, when it comes to a demolition, there's a very clear liability issue, and other times it may not be that imminent. One of the things that Richard attempts to do in this legislation is to provide some definition with regard to the level of urgency. But I'm glad to hear the city is concerned about liability, because I would love for it to address some issues with regard to properties that it owns. As I was listening to the conversation, I was wondering, so that in terms of an early warning system, I'm wondering if it kind of sounds to me, and from what I know about code enforcement, that you don't ask for an engineering report on things unless you think that there's a significant concern about the stability of the building or maybe its systems. And I'm wondering if maybe that's a signal for when the HRC, when you request an engineering report, if it happens to be for a building that's in a historic district, that might be a good time to let HRC and other people who are interested in this issue know that a report has been requested. That an engineering report has been requested, because that is some indication that it's not, oh, well, there's no fire extinguisher kind of thing, or you need to fix the lock on the door or something like that, or something more minor. So so that's one thought. And as I was looking at the legislation and the quarterly reports, I was actually wondering if every month the HRC should be getting some sort of list of buildings that exist in historic districts only, because that's essentially their purview. Maybe we want to expand that a little bit, but to have them be notified monthly of any request for engineering reports. So Rick, I see that you were having a reaction. I'd love to hear your input.
Sure. Well, that's what I was alluding to before is I thought not when we issued the violation to get the engineer's report, because I have to give the owner the opportunity to comply. If they don't comply, we then have the legal authority to move on their non-compliance, which is why I thought if I issue the violation, we need an engineer's report, and it's usually just it's either a 7 to 14 day window of opportunity. If on that 14th day we haven't received that report, that's when I would notify, because that would allow us, if Mr. Myers wanted to go take a look at it with me, we could be on the property under that guise of this could be a potential emergency. I just don't know that I have the right to invite folks onto someone's property before I have an absolute no compliance, and now we're being forced to act upon that non-compliance. That's all I was going to say is, so instead of at the time that I issue it, I guess we could, to give you a heads up, but I just thought it might be, let's see, because believe it or not, people do comply. One of the things I was going to send over, I just didn't have time this afternoon, is I had done a little report, I think it was for the HRC back in, I don't even know, before COVID. But for 2019, I had cited 171 properties, that very violation, that I needed them to get us the engineer's report. Out of that 171 properties, 79 of them complied. So that left 92 that we then sent to court for non-compliance, that if I look them up, I'm sure they still have not complied, and may have already been demolished, of their, from their negligence kind of thing. So our citations do reap some, recourse and compliance. So that's all my thought was, is, once I know they're not going to comply, we could have this conversation. And, I think Bill Brando and I actually, right before COVID, had a similar conversation of kind of uniting forces and being able to do this when we know that there's been no compliance, and I know, I'm not a dummy. I understand these buildings pretty well. I have urgency in my gut that, which is why we're citing them for these things, is I know what's coming down the road, and I know it doesn't take a very long window of opportunity for it to go, bad to, very bad. So.
Am I right with my assumption that the fact that you would be asking for an engineering report is an indication that a particular building may be headed on the path to destabilization and need for demolition? Is that, yeah.
Yeah, there is a percentage that I give that violation to, because it's just unknown. The outside looks okay, but we have no, the windows are boarded up. I can't see if there's daylight through the roof. There's indicators that aren't allowing me to know, all right, I can see the floor or the plaster, collapsing. So we'll issue that, which will usually get a response of, hey, my building's fine, come take a look. So some of those violations aren't maybe necessarily warranted, but I go after it in the hopes that it's preventing, from getting to that point. But a high majority of those violations it's very evident. We can see the erosion in the foundation. I can see the daylight through the roof, standing at the sidewalk. There are some real indicators that that moisture penetration is, pretty relevant.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other comments? Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I know, just noted with Bill, Brando, and Kara Macri, if you wanted to get their comments.
Okay, so we'll turn to public comment now. Shall we start with you, Bill? You want to make comments on this legislation?
Sure. I mean, I guess can you hear me?
Yep.
I believe I'm unmuted. Okay. I couldn't be more happy that this is finally moving along. I looked up today, it was April 1998 was when I became involved in issues like this. And I've been pushing for something like this since shortly thereafter. For 3 years, I worked for Historic Albany Foundation. I was Kara Macri's predecessor by a couple people from 2001 to 2004. And it always troubled me. The Buildings and Codes would contact me at Historic Albany Foundation, and then I would see Rich Nicholson at an event, and he'd have no idea. He was never made aware. So here's a city employee who is in charge of the HRC, who is never made aware of emergency demolitions that were coming. And as Rick mentioned, he and I had a lot of this discussion, about a year ago. But and I think the key is buildings like, and when I was on the HRC for 3.5 years or so, one of the frustrations was buildings like the buildings on the corner of Myrtle and Eagle Street. That was reported in the Times-Union that the city had been looking at that building for a month, a couple of weeks. There was a length of time, and they'd gone back and forth and made the determination that it couldn't be saved. And that's the sort of thing where, why wasn't the HRC at least made aware of that? And there's other types of frustrations where there was a building on Theater Road that was stabilized and then determined to be an emergency demolition. Why couldn't that have gone to an actual HRC agenda to be discussed, whether that needed to come down? Anyway, I think there's a lot that can be discussed, but I think this is a first step. This is the sort of openness and transparency that I was hoping for quite a while ago. To me, this has been not just a preservation issue, this is a government transparency and openness, but not just for the sake of openness and transparency. I truly believe that better end results can come of it. A couple other things that aren't specifically in here, but have been touched on by people talking before. The engineer's report, for a very long time, I've pushed, they should be a design professional report. It is so much easier and in most cases less expensive to find an architect, a licensed architect. I mean, I know the city needs licensure for liability issues, but I think that's something that should be considered, and that's something it could be added to this or a different legislation. But the other thing, somebody mentioned the number of HRC people on the HRC. The HRC's ordinance mentions a city archaeologist about 16 times. I'm making up a number, but it's a number of times. Two archaeologists were added the entire time I was on the HRC, and since then there's only been one on the commission. I think we've only had 8 people that whole time. I've long been a proponent of having that person who I think is very helpful, but they could help the other boards, and that person's stipend for being on the HRC could simply be turned into the role of city archaeologist, who could then weigh in for the other boards in terms of what sorts of underground archaeology. Not that they would be a voting member of those boards, but they could help those boards because that's the way she's been helpful to the HRC, at least when I was on there. So anyway, I'm just very in favor of the report. The proposals, and I think it also could potentially and should allow the city to become more proactive. I think there's a theory that all preservationists only want to save everything. I think, when I was working for HAF, I had to go out and decide whether HAF was going to fight something or not. And often we just, if a building shot, I do think, and Rick's going to disagree with me, but that's fine. We've disagreed before. I do think during the Sheehan administration, that drive to be more proactive, which is absolutely admirable, has also led on some occasions to a widening of the definition of what constitutes an emergency. And I think that's why there just need to be more people in on that discussion. It's not saying that none of those should be declared emergencies, but looking at how buildings are addressed, if the HRC and the knowledgeable people on the HRC were involved earlier, you know, one of the ones I think of is 174, 176 Pearl Street. I think it was 174 was occupied 3 years before it was torn down and sold for $225,000. And until a couple of years ago, you could see on Zillow the pictures of the inside. It seemed like that was one that potentially could be stabilized, except the Palace Theater wanted to expand into that space. To me, that should have been, there should have been public comment on that. But anyway, we don't need to go down those rabbit holes, but there's just a lot of things that I think the openness and transparency is important. And I really do believe that all of the engineers' reports should be given to the HRC after the fact to look at them, because again, they're public documents. That's part of the transparency. And Rich and I talked about this. I don't remember why he decided not to put this in, but I think the demolition reports, if it's outside of a historic district, should go to the planning board. You know, if they would have to review a demolition, I think every demolition report that's issued should go to the appropriate oversight body within the city. Anyway, that's my soapbox.
Thank you, Bill. Cara, would you like to make any comments?
Yes. Can you
Okay.
guys hear me? Sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, I'm doing this on my phone in the car while my son's at Taekwondo, and
Oh.
it's beyond my technological capabilities. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. Historic Albany is as excited as Bill is about this, and I won't go into all the reasons because he's pretty much covered them. But this is definitely something that we've been very happy at and looking forward to for a long time. I think the early warning systems, things that we've been talking about, are really important, and I'm really glad these conversations are happening. I know that Sam and Rick have been working on an amazing number of really proactive things that I think are already starting to show in fewer emergency demolitions and more stabilizations. So that's really great. What I like about this amendment particularly, and what Historic Albany is very excited about as well, is really the review component of it. And the only question feedback I think that we had about that was it seems to be a one-off thing as opposed to kind of periodic, whether it's yearly or whatnot, kind of review and discussion with the HRC on more of a procedural level, not case by case, like, oh, what to do about this building, but more general policies and procedures. A lot of things that we've been talking about is treating the adjacent building when a building must come down. So Dove Street was a perfect example of that. There's another one in the South End. I mean, I cite individual ones, but there's dozens and dozens every year that have buildings that they're really constructed as one building. And I think that's where the HRC's expertise can really shine, because this is what they do all day. And this is really their focus, is how do you fix broken historic buildings? And so the repair component, they have a lot of expertise to bring that and kind of help create better procedures for how do you deal with these situations, whether it's kind of general things. Okay, when we have this sort of situation with an adjacent building, these are the actions that are taken afterward to button up, like those sorts of kind of very general things that can be applied to kind of typologies, so that when these emergency actions do pop up, there's kind of a very clear road that happens, and it's one that everyone is familiar with and comfortable with. And it's something that also would change, which is why I think having that review maybe periodic might be a good thing, because as all of these proactive things are paying off, you're going to see hopefully fewer demolitions, and maybe the ones that we're seeing are a little bit different. And so that procedure should change a little based on need. So that was our only kind of comment, was could that be changed so it's not just a one-time review, and saying could it be something that's more periodic so that it changes as needed.
Okay, well, terrific. It sounds like there's a lot of good ideas here. Everyone, wants to move forward on this, but to find a way that it works best. So Rich, do you have any thoughts about how you'd like to proceed?
Yeah, and I just want to note, because Bill had referenced the other, there are kind of two different demo procedures in the city. One relates to historic districts, which is older, and that's the one that I'm dealing with. There, a few years ago, we put in provisions related to demos outside of historic districts, where it would be a review process through the planning department. And Brad, I think those provisions were incorporated into the USDO, but I think they're basically the same, where there is a demo review process through the planning department in non-historic districts, which is a little bit different than, and it was a whole other area. So I was just wanting to focus on the historic district area.
Now I remember you mentioning that, but I think that was pre-COVID. It was a long time ago. We had that conversation, so I couldn't remember.
Okay. I know that we need to make some refinements here and some clarifications, and John indicated the HRC was going to continue to look at it. And I think you indicated have some comments back on or before March 4th or 5th or something, March 5th. Obviously, my time on the council is limited, and I'm not planning on coming back next year, so I'd like to wrap this up. If we can, I mean, I'm okay holding for tonight, and let's do some of the refinements, and if there are comments from the departments that we need to incorporate, if we can get that information, or the law department, and just try to refine this in a way, maybe incorporate some of the other provisions from the preservation plan, like some type of a reference to an early warning system. If that's something that, enough just to put a reference in there. We're not designing the whole thing at this point, but I'd like to be able to move on it and get something through. But I know we need to make some refinements before it's ready to come before the council.
So are we looking at sometime in March then, Rich, to get back together on this? Or do you want to get back in touch when you think it's?
I'd like to get it done earlier than that, but I know that John had mentioned the HRC discussion, and they might not have anything. They're hoping to have recommendations on or before March 5th. So I don't know, John, in terms of your timetable.
Well, we can certainly accelerate the pace of discussing this and formulating our recommendations. I think it's important to the legislation to get it out there as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a meeting at the end of January, and then I think our meeting in March is on the 3rd, I believe. Oh, no, it's on the 5th. It is on March 5th.
That's the next meeting after the January?
Correct, yes.
Oh, I see.
So is it possible to have discussion at the January meeting?
We could add it to the agenda.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so maybe you might be able to have something out of that meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah. No, we'll work on that.
Okay.
Kathy,
Tom.
yeah, I had my hand up before we went to public.
I apologize.
No worries. But if you don't mind, I just had a couple of questions for Rick, if he doesn't mind.
Yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Rick, well, number one, thank you. We've had only one demolition up by me, and you guys were really good, and I appreciate it. So, keep up the good work. My question is, I'm an IT guy, and there's different databases in the city, and I'm just trying to think. I know the assessor's office goes around, takes pictures of property throughout the city so they can do the assessment. Is that something maybe we could have built in where, there's like a grading of the building, so we get a better way of keeping an eye on, who's deteriorating over the years? I just had that question for you.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about the assessor and what they can do or not do, but Sam Wells, who works for me, that's one of his main roles is the vacant buildings, and that's something that he does do throughout the year. So he's constantly out evaluating, reevaluating. Not necessarily. I mean, his initial look at the buildings, he had set up a criteria and was kind of rating them. But we really haven't had to need the rating as much as when he sees stuff, we're citing them. I mean, so we work hand in hand. So I don't know if we still need that or not. And actually, I think spoken to Bill Brando about going out as a group, looking at these buildings too, and coming up with our own rating system for, ones we could look at. Yeah, so I'm not really sure, what the assessor does or doesn't do, but.
See, I'm concerned about not abandoned buildings, but buildings that are slowly deteriorating over the years. And, how do we get hold and, let people know there might be grants available or some way that we can save these before they go. I had one more other question was, have you started using the drone? At one point you were talking about using drones to be able to look at the top of the buildings and stuff.
Yeah, we are actually scheduled to start our training next week.
Oh,
So we have not started using them as of yet. We still have access, as needed. But that's finally, we've selected the vendor. We are scheduled for, I saw an email this afternoon. I think we start some training next week. We can have up to 10 of my staff. I think I have it limited to about 5 right now because I just don't want everybody, hands on. But yeah, we are moving forward with that pretty rapidly now.
Thank you
It's a
so
great way
much.
to do roof inspections.
And if I could just real quick, Tom, so with the city's RISE grant that we won, one of the positions we have that's coming out of it, they're kind of, Sam is the vacant building guy. It's kind of the equivalent to Sam, but for the active, occupied buildings. So, I mean, we know and we see these buildings and, we cite them. I mean, I know which ones are, kind of lagging, through our building blocks program. We can kind of see ones that are potentially going to be vacant. There's criteria that we can punch in that tell us based on, amount of code violations, water usage, et cetera, that these buildings may potentially become vacant. So, I mean, we're actively on this currently. So I don't really foresee a whole lot of things kind of slipping through the cracks, although there's always something. But we are more proactive as a department than I think the city's ever been, quite honestly. So there's so many, and a lot of this is, all hand in hand. And I told Bill, several months ago, I still believe in 3 years, we're not doing emergency demolitions. I believe that wholeheartedly. I believe unless it's a catastrophic fire or incident, it won't be by neglect. I believe we have the things in place and we're doing the right things and we're all working together, not in our own little silos that, we're going to be dealing with more stabilizations and holding the folks accountable that this is not going to be something, I believe in 3 years, there are no more emergency demolitions unless it's a fire or something like that.
Thank you, Rick. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, well, I think that there's been a lot of good discussion tonight on these issues and work that's going to be done, conversations that are going to be had about how you can move forward and find a piece of legislation that works for everyone here. So I guess we'll plan to reconvene sometime in late February. Rich?
Yeah, I mean, but it sounds like everybody's on board, so it's just a matter of
Yeah.
really making the refinements we need to make, and I'd like to really get it through as quickly as possible.
Okay, so well, thank you, everyone. And unless there's any other comments, I'd like to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, in a second.
Second.
Judy. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
All
you.
right, good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Yep.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Rich.